I think about that night a lot, mostly because it feels like the version of me who lived through it died in that hallway, and the person standing here now is just a ghost haunting the ruins of a life that looked perfect on paper. My name is Sarah, and until 6 months ago, I was living the kind of life that people on social media look at and hate. I had the 4-bedroom house in the suburbs of Ohio, the kind with the wraparound porch and the manicured lawn that cost a small fortune in landscaping every month. I had the husband, Mark, who worked in corporate logistics and smelled like expensive sandalwood and stability. And I had Tyler. Tyler was my stepson, Mark's son from his first marriage, and at 19, he was basically a permanent fixture in our home. He was supposed to be in his first year of community college, but let's be honest, he was mostly in our basement playing video games, eating us out of house and home, and drifting through life with that effortless, slightly entitled charm that only a guy his age can pull off. We had a good relationship. It was professional, almost. I wasn't trying to be his mother. I knew better than that. But I was the cool stepmom who kept the fridge stocked with the beer he liked and never asked too many questions about why he stayed up until 4 a.m. We were a unit, or at least I thought we were. The shift started subtly, the way these things always do, like a slow leak in a pipe you don't notice until the floorboards start to warp. Mark had been traveling more, taking on these regional director roles that kept him in Chicago or Detroit for days at a time. It left the house feeling cavernous, quiet in a way that started to get under my skin. I worked as a freelance marketing consultant, so I was home most of the time, working from the home office upstairs. It was just me and Tyler, drifting through the hallways like ships in the night. He was going through a breakup, some girl from his high school, and he'd started spending more time upstairs, hanging out in the living room while I watched TV, just venting. I thought it was progress. I thought I was being a good parent figure by listening. Then there was Jessica. Jessica had been my best friend since we were undergrads at Ohio State. We had been through everything together. The bad jobs, the worse men, the existential dread of turning 30. When her apartment lease ended and she was stuck between living arrangements, I was the one who insisted she crash on our couch. Mark was hesitant. He said it would disrupt our routine, but I pushed for it. I missed having someone to drink wine with, someone to talk to who wasn't just a teenager obsessed with his kill-death ratio on a headset. I wanted the house to feel alive again, even if it was just for a few weeks while she got her life sorted. For the first 2 weeks, it was like being back in our 20s. We'd stay up late, laughing until our stomachs hurt, drinking cheap Pinot Grigio and complaining about the neighbors. Tyler didn't seem to mind. In fact, he seemed to enjoy the energy. He'd wander into the kitchen while we were hanging out, grabbing a slice of pizza or a soda, and he'd joke around with Jessica. She was only 6 years older than him, and she had this way of making everything feel like a joke, like the world was just a backdrop for her own personal sitcom. I loved her for it. I felt safe. I felt like I had successfully curated a little ecosystem of people I cared about, all tucked away in our suburban sanctuary. The financial side of things was where the cracks really started to show, though I was too blinded by my own contentment to see it. I had been managing our joint accounts, the ones Mark and I kept for household expenses, and I noticed that money was disappearing. Not huge, alarming amounts at first, but little dribbles, 100 here, 200 there. At first, I thought it was just the cost of living skyrocketing. I thought maybe Tyler had been buying games, or maybe I was just forgetting my own impulse purchases on Amazon. I'd check the statements, feel a twinge of anxiety, and then push it down. I trusted them. That was my fatal mistake. I gave them access, I gave them space, and I assumed that because I loved them, they would never dream of taking anything that wasn't theirs. It was a Tuesday, the kind of gray, miserable day that makes you want to crawl back into bed and hide from the world. Mark was away in Minneapolis, and he wasn't due back until Friday. I had a client meeting in the city that was supposed to last all day, but when I got there, the partner had a family emergency, and the whole thing was canceled. I stood in the parking lot of the office building, the rain misting against my windshield, and felt that weird, hollow feeling of suddenly having 8 hours of empty time. I didn't want to go home to an empty house, but the thought of sitting in a coffee shop for hours sounded even worse. I decided to drive back, maybe grab some lunch, and surprise the house with some takeout. I remember the drive back home being unusually vivid. The trees were turning that deep, wet autumnal brown, and the radio was playing some old pop song that reminded me of my own teenage years. I felt good. I felt like I was heading toward a nice, quiet afternoon. I walked into the house through the garage, expecting to see Jessica on the couch with her laptop, or to hear the muted chaos of Tyler's video games drifting up from the basement. But the house was dead silent. It was a heavy, oppressive kind of silence, the kind that feels like pressure against your eardrums. I set the bags of takeout on the kitchen island and called out their names. No answer. I walked through the kitchen, my heels clicking on the hardwood, feeling a strange prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I went into the living room, but it was empty. The TV was off, the throw pillows were scattered, and Jessica's laptop was sitting on the coffee table, open, with the screen black. I frowned. It wasn't like her to leave her tech just lying around. I checked the basement door. It was slightly ajar. I figured Tyler was down there, maybe asleep. I walked toward the stairs, intending to tell them about the food, but then I heard it. It wasn't a voice. It was a sound. A muffled, rhythmic sound coming from the guest bedroom down the hall on the main floor. The guest bedroom was where Jessica had been sleeping. My heart started to beat a little faster, a frantic bird-like flutter in my chest. I walked toward the door. I didn't mean to go to it. I just felt drawn to the silence, to the weird energy of the house. As I got closer, I saw that the door was cracked open by about an inch. The hallway light was off, but I could see the sliver of light from inside the room spilling out onto the carpet. I should have walked away. I should have turned around, gone back to the kitchen, and started eating my lunch. That's what a rational person would have done. But my brain was stuck in a loop of confusion. Why were they in the guest room? Why were they so quiet? I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and pressed my fingertips against the cold wood of the door. I didn't knock. I don't know why. Maybe I was afraid of the answer, or maybe I already knew the answer and I just needed to see the carnage for myself. I pushed the door open just enough so that I could see inside without being seen. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a bedside lamp. Jessica was sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to me, her hair spilling over her shoulders. She was wearing that oversized silk robe I'd given her for her birthday last year. And then I saw Tyler. He was standing in front of her, his hands resting on her knees, his face unreadable, his eyes locked on hers with a kind of intensity I had never seen him direct at anyone before. They were talking in hushed, urgent tones, their voices blending into a low hum that I couldn't quite decode. But it wasn't the talking that stopped my heart. It was the way they were holding each other. It wasn't the way a stepson and a houseguest hold each other. It was intimate. It was possessive. And then I saw the stack of papers on the nightstand. My bank statements, the ones I had been trying to reconcile, the ones that showed the massive, unaccounted for withdrawals. My mind went blank. The world narrowed down to the sight of them, huddled together over my financial ruin, laughing softly about something I couldn't hear. I felt a cold wave wash over me, a physical sickness that started in my stomach and spread to my fingertips. I backed away, the door still slightly ajar, my breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. I didn't want them to hear me. I didn't want them to know that I knew. I walked back toward the kitchen, my legs feeling like lead, my head spinning with the realization that the betrayal wasn't just about the money, or the secrecy, or the fact that the two people I trusted most in the world were conspiring in my guest room. It was the realization that I had been living in a house of mirrors, and everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and my family was a lie I had been telling myself to keep the walls from caving in. I grabbed my keys, turned around, and walked out the front door, leaving the takeout on the island, leaving the life I had built, and stepping out into the rain with absolutely no idea what to do next. I sat in my car for what felt like an eternity, the engine running, the wipers slapping against the windshield in a rhythm that matched the frantic beating of my heart. The suburbs of Ohio usually felt safe, a cocoon of manicured lawns and reliable neighbors, but that night, the street lamps felt like interrogation lights, and every passing car felt like a threat. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to grip the steering wheel with both palms just to keep them steady. I kept seeing the image of them in that room, the way Tyler's hands had rested on Jessica's knees, the look of predatory calculation in their eyes. It wasn't just the betrayal of the affair, if that's even what it was. It was the absolute cold-blooded way they were handling my finances, looking at the numbers like they were tallying up the price of my soul. I didn't go back in. I couldn't. I put the car in gear and drove, not having a destination, just needing to put miles between myself and the house. I ended up in a parking lot of a 24-hour diner near the highway, the kind of place that smells like burnt coffee and disappointment. I sat in a booth in the back, the red vinyl cracked and peeling, and tried to process what I had seen. My brain was firing on all cylinders, trying to connect the dots. The missing money, the weird tension between the two of them that I had dismissed as casual friendship, the way Tyler had suddenly become so attentive to Jessica's needs, always offering to drive her places or buy her things. It was all so obvious in hindsight. I felt like the biggest idiot in the world. I was the benefactor, the fool who had opened her home to a leech and a snake, and now I was paying the price. I pulled out my phone and logged into my bank app, my fingers fumbling with the password. When the balance loaded, I let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. It wasn't just a few $100s. It was thousands. Over the last 3 months, they had drained the high-yield savings account that Mark and I had set aside for our anniversary trip to Italy. They had been siphoning it off into smaller, untraceable accounts, probably using some kind of digital payment service to hide the paper trail. I looked at the transaction history, the dates, the locations. They had been doing this right under my nose, while I was upstairs working, while I was cooking dinner, while I was treating them like family. The rage that started to boil up in my gut was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't a hot, screaming rage. It was cold and sharp, the kind that makes you want to tear things down. I needed to call Mark, but my thumb hovered over his name and I just couldn't do it. How do you tell your husband that his son, the boy he raised, is stealing from you and carrying on with your best friend in your own home? I knew Mark. I knew he would go nuclear. He would come home, he would confront them, and it would end in a scene that would destroy whatever was left of his relationship with his son. I wasn't ready for that. I needed to know the full extent of it first. I needed to catch them in a way they couldn't deny, a way that would make it impossible for them to spin the story. I was no longer the naive stepmom. I was a woman who had been pushed into a corner, and I was going to fight back. I stayed at that diner for hours, staring at the wall, drinking cup after cup of bitter coffee. I started to map it out. I needed proof. I knew they were planning something bigger. The way they were looking at those papers, the intensity of their conversation, it felt like they were getting ready to jump ship. I needed to play the long game. I needed to go back to that house and pretend that everything was normal. That realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had to go back to the scene of the crime, act like the clueless, loving stepmother, and watch them every single second, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a terrifying prospect, but it was the only way to get my life back, or at least the only way to save what was left of it. I drove back to the house around midnight. The lights were off and the place looked as serene and perfect as it always did. I pulled into the garage, my stomach turning, and walked into the house with my keys held like a weapon. The air inside felt different, heavy with a secret that I was now carrying on my own. I went to the kitchen and saw the takeout bags were gone. They had eaten the food I brought. They had consumed my offering, knowing I had been right there. The thought made me want to scream, but I kept my face blank, my movements deliberate. I went to the guest bedroom, but the door was shut and the house was silent. I checked the basement door and it was locked. I went upstairs, undressed, and crawled into bed next to the empty side of the mattress. I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening to the house, every creak of the floorboards sounding like an intruder. I thought about the money. I thought about the way Jessica had looked at me just the day before, giving me a hug and telling me how much she appreciated me. The layers of the deception were so thick, I could barely breathe. What did they want? Was it just the money? Or was there something else? Maybe Tyler was resentful of the way I had stepped into his mother's place, even though I had tried so hard to be respectful. Maybe Jessica had always been jealous of my marriage, of the life I had built. The possibilities were endless, and all of them were poisoned. The next morning, I woke up before anyone else. I went downstairs, made a pot of coffee, and sat at the kitchen island, just waiting. I wanted to see their faces. I wanted to see if they could look me in the eye. Tyler came up first, his hair a mess, wearing a t-shirt I'd bought him. He walked to the fridge, grabbed a carton of orange juice, and took a long swig. He looked at me, and for a second I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not guilt, but awareness. He knew I had come home early. He knew I had been there. He just didn't know how much I had seen. "Hey," he said, his voice casual, almost bored. "Didn't hear you come in last night. Did you have a good day?" I looked at him, and I felt a chill run down my spine. He was good. He was really good.
"Meeting got canceled," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. I came back, but I ended up just turning around and heading back out to grab a hotel room. Too much work to do. Didn't want to get distracted by the house. I lied with such ease it surprised even me. "How was your night?" He shrugged, his eyes scanning the counter. "Fine, just chilled. Jessica and I watched a movie." Jessica walked into the kitchen then, looking fresh and innocent in her pajamas. She smiled at me, that same bright, fake smile she had been wearing for weeks. "Hey, Sarah, you're up early. You didn't even say hi when you got back yesterday. I thought you were just busy." She was testing me. She wanted to know if I had seen anything. I kept my eyes on my coffee, not letting her get a read on me. "Yeah, I was exhausted. Just didn't want to bother anyone." I felt like a spy in my own home, every word a tactical move. The air between us was electric, charged with the unspoken reality of the situation. I knew she was lying, she knew I was lying, and yet we were both going through the motions of our regular, domestic lives. The rest of the day was a blur of performative normality. I did my work, I checked my bank accounts, I watched them from the corner of my eye. I saw the way they communicated, a glance across the table, a quick text, a brush of their arms in the hallway. It was so blatant now that I wondered how I had ever missed it. They weren't just stealing money. They were building a life together, right under my roof, at my expense. I felt a surge of cold, hard resolve. I wasn't going to let them win. I wasn't going to be the victim who just faded away. I was going to find out exactly what they were planning, and I was going to burn it all down. As the afternoon dragged on, I started to notice things I hadn't before. A pile of mail that hadn't been opened, a hidden key on the top shelf of the pantry, a small black notebook that Jessica kept tucked under her pillow, which I managed to peek at while she was in the shower. It was full of numbers, bank account codes, and dates. It was a ledger of our downfall. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely read the entries, but I took a photo of every single page with my phone. I felt like I was holding a live grenade. This was the proof I needed. This was the evidence that would blow their little world apart. I felt a sense of grim satisfaction. They thought they were in control, that they had played me for a fool, but they had no idea who they were really dealing with. The game was far from over. The days that followed the discovery of that notebook felt like living in a pressurized chamber. Every time I looked at Jessica, I saw the handwriting in that little black book, the precise, calculated digits that mapped out the liquidation of my security. Every time I looked at Tyler, I saw the boy who had sat at our dinner table for years, the one I had helped with college applications, the one I had bought gifts for on birthdays, now reduced to a conspirator in a pathetic, low-stakes heist. The sheer audacity of it burned. They weren't just stealing money, they were stealing my history, rewriting the narrative of my marriage while I was forced to play the role of the oblivious, supportive stepmother. I knew I had to keep up the charade until Mark came home. That was the finish line. I needed him to be here, to be the witness to their betrayal, so there would be no way for them to gaslight me, no way for them to spin a story where I was the crazy, insecure woman imagining things. I spent my days acting, performing a version of Sarah that was serene, focused, and completely occupied by her work. I'd spend hours in my office with the door locked, ostensibly working, but in reality, I was building a dossier. I cross-referenced the dates in the black notebook with the transaction history on my phone. They had been sloppy. They had been moving money into an account set up in a town 2 states over, a shell account they probably thought was untraceable. They were amateurs. They were playing with fire, and they had no idea that I had already doused the room in gasoline. One evening, about 2 days before Mark was scheduled to return, the tension in the house reached a breaking point. It was late, around 10.
I was in the kitchen pouring a glass of wine when Jessica walked in. She had that look on her face again, that fake concern masked as curiosity look. She sat on the stool opposite the island, watching me as I swirled the wine in my glass. "You've been acting weird lately, Sarah," her voice dripping with artificial empathy. "Is everything okay? You seem distant. Is it something with Mark?" I turned to look at her, really looking at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel the impulse to look away. I saw the cheapness of her outfit, the way she was trying to adopt my mannerisms, the way she had tried to inhabit my space. "Mark is fine, Jessica," I said, my voice steady, ice cold. "Everything is exactly where it's supposed to be." I took a sip of my wine, watching her eyes flicker. "Why? Are you worried that something might change?" She laughed, a brittle, nervous sound. "No, we care about you. Tyler and I were talking and we're worried about you. You've been working so hard." "That's funny," I said, leaning forward slightly, letting my shadow fall across the counter between us. "Funny how you and Tyler are always talking about me. You spend a lot of time together, don't you? It's almost like you're closer than just friends." She froze. The smile didn't vanish, but it turned into something frozen, something predatory. "We're just close, Sarah. You're lucky to have a stepson who actually likes hanging out with his family."
Not everyone has that, you know? "Oh, I know," I replied, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm very aware of what I have, Jessica, and I'm very aware of what's been taken." I didn't give her a chance to respond. I just picked up my glass and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her sitting there in the silence. I knew that conversation had rattled her. I knew she was going to run straight to Tyler, and that was exactly what I wanted. I needed them to feel the pressure. I needed them to know that the walls were closing in. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my office chair, listening to the muffled sounds of their voices downstairs. They were arguing. I couldn't hear the words, but the tone was unmistakable, sharp, frantic, desperate. They were realizing that I wasn't the idiot they thought I was. I felt a grim, dark thrill in my chest. They were panicking. They were probably trying to figure out how much I knew, how much I had proof of, and whether they should just pack up and bolt. But they wouldn't leave yet. They hadn't gotten everything they wanted. There was still a sizable chunk of the equity from the house, and they were greedy. Greed is a predictable motivator. It keeps people in the trap even when they know the jaws are about to snap shut. The next day was a blur of agonizing waiting. I felt like a coiled spring. I did my errands, I acted normal at the grocery store, I smiled at the neighbors. Everything felt like a film set, a perfectly constructed lie. I kept thinking about Mark. When he walked through that front door, his home was going to be shattered. I felt a deep, profound grief for that. I loved him. And even though I was doing this for self-preservation, I hated that I had to be the one to bring the truth to him. I was going to be the one to destroy the life he thought he had. I was going to be the one to tell him that his son was a thief and his friend was a liar. By the time Friday arrived, the air in the house was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Tyler barely left the basement, and Jessica was constantly pacing the living room, checking her phone every 30 seconds. They were waiting for me to crack, but I had never felt more composed. I had all the evidence printed out in a folder in my office. I had bank statements, screenshots of the transfer records, and even a log of the dates and times I had observed them acting suspiciously. I was ready. At 6 in the evening, the garage door opened. I was standing in the kitchen, a glass of water in my hand, staring out the window at the driveway. Mark's truck pulled in, the headlights cutting through the dusk. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his face drawn.
He stepped out of the truck, and for a moment, he just stood there in the garage, taking a deep breath of home air. He didn't know yet. He didn't know that the house he was walking into was a tomb. I walked to the door to greet him, putting on the mask one last time. He gave me a tired smile, hugged me, and kissed my forehead. "God, it's good to be back," he sighed. "I missed this. I missed you." "I missed you too, Mark," I said, and for a split second, the emotion was real. I did miss him. I missed the man he was before all of this, the man who believed in the life we were building. Behind me, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Tyler was coming up from the basement, and Jessica was watching in from the living room. The cast was assembled. The final act was about to begin. I looked at their faces as they saw Mark, the performative joy, the feigned relief, and I felt a surge of cold, detached anger. It was time. I didn't wait for dinner. I didn't wait for him to get settled. I just looked at him, then back at them, and said, "We need to talk. All of us. In the living room. Now." Mark looked confused, sensing this sudden shift in the atmosphere. "What's wrong, Sarah?" "Everything," I said, turning and walking toward the living room, my heels clicking on the hardwood with the sound of a countdown. They followed me, Jessica's face a mask of nervous bravado, Tyler's eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that didn't exist. I reached the center of the room, turned to face them, and felt the weight of the last 3 months pressing down on my shoulders.
সাগরের ঢেউ দেখিয়া নাই মন সাগরে, নানা মিলে সাধন ভজন সকলি যাই বিফলে গো, সকলি যাই বিফলে। ওরে রূপ সাগরের ঢেউ দেখিয়া নাই মন সাগরে, নানা মিলে সাধন ভজন সকলি যাই বিফলে গো, সকলি যাই বিফলে। আহা সাগরের দুই মোহনা, একটি আশায় একটি যাওয়া, সাধক যারা নাই মোতারা, সাধক যাহারা নাই মোতারা, সাধক যারা নাই মোতারা, সাধক সারা যায় ডুবে। রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে মনে, রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে। সাগরের খাইছো ননি আসিয়া এই ববেতে, ওরে আরেক সাগরটাকে তোমায় নিতে তার মোহনাতে গো, নিতে তার মোহনাতে। ও এক সাগরের খাইছো ননি আসিয়া এই ববেতে, আরেক সাগরটাকে তোমায় নিতে তার মোহনাতে গো, নিতে তার মোহনাতে। ওরে মোহনাতে জুয়ার বাটা, মোহনাতে জুয়ার বাটা, না জানিয়া যাব দিলে মন মরবি অকালে। রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে মনে, রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে। সাগরের সাধক যারা তারা নাইমা সাগরে, আরে এক চুমুকে শুকাই পানি, ডুবার বয়তার না থাকে গো, ডুবার বয়তার না থাকে। রূপসাগরের সাধক যারা তারা নাইমা সাগরে, এক চুমুকে শুকাই পানি, ডুবার ভয় তার না থাকে গো, ডুবার ভয় তার না থাকে। ওরে জয় বেবে কয় সাধক সারা, জয় বেবে কয় সাধক সারা, জয় বেবে কয় সাধক সারা, জুয়ার আসলে যাই ডুবে। রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে মনে, রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে, রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে, রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে।
Shoulders. I was about to set fire to my own house, but I knew with absolute certainty that it was the only way to get out alive. The silence in the living room was so heavy it felt like it was physically crushing the air out of my lungs. Mark stood near the fireplace, his suitcase still by the door, his brow furrowed in genuine concern. He didn't have a clue. He looked at me, then at the floor, then at the two people who were currently dismantling his life with surgical precision. Tyler was pacing, his movements jittery and unfocused, while Jessica had crossed her arms, a defensive wall built of sheer, unadulterated vanity. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and I was the one who was about to give the push. I didn't start with the money. That was too easy, too transactional. I started with the truth of the house. I walked over to the coffee table, picked up the black notebook I had retrieved from Jessica's room, and dropped it onto the glass surface. The sound it made, a sharp, dull thud, seemed to echo through the entire house. I saw Jessica flinch, her eyes widening as she recognized her own handwriting on the spine. Tyler stopped pacing, his gaze locked on the book as if it were a bomb. I looked at Mark, my voice steady, stripped of all the performance I'd been keeping up for the last week. Mark, I said, and his name sounded foreign, thin and brittle in the cold air of the room. We need to talk about what's been happening under this roof while you were away.
We need to talk about why our savings accounts are empty, and why for the past month, the two people I trusted most have been treating this home like their own personal piggy bank. Mark's face shifted, the confusion hardening into something sharper, something more protective. Sarah, what are you talking about? He stepped toward me, his hands raised in a gesture of caution. What is that book? Jessica stepped forward then, her voice a shrill, desperate attempt to reclaim the narrative. She's lost her mind, Mark. She's been spiraling for weeks, talking to herself, stalking around the house. I don't know what she thinks she saw, but she's clearly having some kind of breakdown. You know how stressed she's been with the consulting work. I didn't even look at her. I just stared at Tyler. He was the one I wanted to break. I wanted to see the moment the mask fell off. Tyler, tell him, I said, my voice quiet, dangerous. Tell him about the account in Dayton. Tell him about the wire transfers you initiated from my laptop while I was in the shower. Tell him about the way you and Jessica sit in the guest bedroom and laugh about how easy it was to manipulate the person who was actually paying for your lifestyle. Tyler's face turned a sickly ashen gray. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his eyes darting to the floor. He looked so small in that moment, so pathetic, not the confident, entitled young man who had been strutting around my house like he owned it.
He looked like a coward who had finally been caught in the headlights. Mark turned his gaze toward his son, and I saw the absolute devastation in his eyes. It was the look of a man watching his world fracture in real time. Tyler? Mark whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and fury. Tell me she's lying. Tell me none of this is true. Tyler didn't say a word. He just stood there, his jaw locked, his shoulders hunched. The silence was his confession. Jessica, however, wasn't done yet. She lunged toward the table, her hands reaching for the notebook, but I was faster. I snatched it up, holding it out of her reach, my eyes meeting hers with a cold, piercing intensity. You're done, Jessica. You're done in this house, you're done in this marriage, and you're certainly done with my bank accounts. I've already taken screenshots of everything. I've already alerted the bank to the fraudulent activity. The police aren't involved yet, but that's entirely up to how the rest of this conversation goes. The shift in the room was palpable. The air felt thin, electric with the sudden, violent death of a lie. Mark walked over to Tyler, his voice low, vibrating with a rage I had never seen him direct at anyone. You did this? You took money from us? You took money that was meant for our future? He grabbed Tyler by the shoulder, spinning him around. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Tyler finally broke.
He looked up at his father, his eyes swimming with tears, not of remorse, but of pure, unadulterated fear. "She's the one who suggested it, Dad." He pointed a shaking finger at Jessica. "She told me you were never going to notice. She told me you were just going to divorce her eventually, and that we needed to make sure we were taken care of. She played on everything. She told me that she deserved it for all the years she spent helping you, for all the time she felt ignored." I watched as the betrayal hit Mark with the force of a physical blow. He looked from his son to Jessica, and for a second, I thought he might actually collapse. The betrayal wasn't just that they stole the money, it was that they had weaponized his love for his son against him. Jessica had manipulated a 19-year-old into committing a crime against his own family, all while pretending to be my best friend. The cold, calculating nature of it was breathtaking. I looked at Jessica, who was now standing in the middle of the room, her composure completely shattered. She was trembling, her hands gripping her elbows, her face a mask of ruined pride. "She's a liar, Mark," she hissed, her voice sounding like a hiss of a snake. "He's just saying that because he's a coward. We were doing this for us. You never cared about us. You were always just obsessed with your work, with your perfect suburban life. We were just props in your little play." I felt a surge of cold, sharp clarity wash over me. It didn't matter what they said anymore. The truth was out. The cards were on the table, and the house of cards had finally collapsed. I walked over to the mantel and picked up my phone, which was sitting next to the framed photo of the three of us, Mark, Tyler, and me, from our trip to the lake last summer. I picked it up and held it for a moment, looking at the smiles that now looked like masks. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, I turned to Mark. "Mark," I said, my voice steady, even, and devoid of any lingering affection, "I need you to understand one thing. I love you, but I cannot stay in this house for one more second. I cannot look at your son, and I certainly cannot be in the same room as her. I've already packed a bag. I'm going to my sister's in the city. You need to handle this. You need to deal with the money. You need to deal with your son. And you need to get her out of this house before I call the police and let them handle it." Mark looked at me, his eyes pleading, searching for a way to fix what had been irrevocably broken. "Sarah, please, we can talk about this. We can fix this." I shook my head, a slow, sad smile touching my lips. "There's nothing to fix, Mark. You can't fix a foundation that's been rotted out from the inside." I turned and walked toward the door, my heart feeling like a heavy, cold stone in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't look at Tyler, who was weeping openly now, or Jessica, who was watching me with a mixture of hatred and fear. I just walked out the door, into the cool night air, and didn't stop until I reached my car. I sat behind the wheel, the keys in my hand, and for the first time in months, I felt the terrifying, beautiful weight of being completely, utterly alone. I started the engine, backed out of the driveway, and didn't look back at the house that had been my life. The silence inside my sister's guest room was the loudest thing I had ever experienced. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the suburban house back in Ohio, but a clean, sterile, terrifying kind of quiet. I sat on the edge of the bed for 3 days, my suitcase still zipped shut, staring at the wall, feeling like a patient who had just undergone a traumatic surgery and was waiting to see if their body would actually accept the stitches. Every time my phone buzzed, a jolt of pure adrenaline would sear through me, but I didn't check it. I knew what it would be. Texts from Mark, begging, bargaining, promising to kick them out, to fix the bank accounts, to restore the life that I now understood had been a hollowed-out shell for months. By the 4th day, the anger had finally started to settle into a cold, hard floor of reality. I realized that my life hadn't been stolen from me. It had been dismantled by my own desire to be the perfect wife, the perfect stepmother, the perfect friend. I had been so obsessed with creating a picturesque environment that I had stopped looking at the people inhabiting it. I had let Jessica slide into my personal space because I wanted to feel needed, and I had coddled Tyler because I wanted to feel like a mother figure, even though he was already a man, and a deeply flawed one at that.
The betrayal wasn't just theirs. It was a mirror held up to my own desperate need for control. I finally opened my phone. There were 42 missed calls from Mark and a dozen texts from Jessica. Pathetic, rambling messages trying to shift the blame, talking about how they were going through a hard time, how they had just been confused, how they hadn't meant for it to go that far. I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I called a lawyer. I didn't want a conversation. I wanted a total surgical separation. I wanted the assets divided, the house sold, and the ties severed with the clinical efficiency of a company shutting down a failed branch. I wasn't going to be the martyr. I was going to be the one who walked away with her dignity and what was left of her savings. When the time came to go back to the house to retrieve my remaining things, I didn't go alone. I hired a moving company to do it while Mark was at work, and I brought my sister for moral support. Stepping back into that space was like walking through a crime scene. Everything looked exactly the same, yet it felt utterly alien. The photos of us on the wall looked like evidence from a cold case. My office was stripped bare. I found a few things of mine in the guest room, a scarf I'd left behind, a book on the nightstand, and I shoved them into a box with a feeling of deep, cleansing repulsion. I saw Tyler before I left. He was sitting on the back porch, staring out at the yard with a vacant, haunted look. He looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his own actions. When he saw me, he didn't say anything. He just looked away, his jaw tight. I stood there for a moment, waiting for a spark of something, remorse, anger, explanation, but there was nothing. He was just a boy who had broken the world and had no idea how to glue it back together. I realized then that I didn't hate him anymore. I felt nothing for him. He was a stranger. I walked past him without a word, my heels clicking on the deck, and headed for the driveway. Mark was there when I was loading the last of the boxes. He had come home early. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week, his clothes wrinkled, his eyes hollowed out by grief. He stood by the garage door, his hands in his pockets, looking like a man waiting for a bus that had already passed him by. "Sarah," he said, his voice raw, "we can figure this out. I've already told Jessica she has to leave by the end of the weekend. I'm going to make this right." I stopped and looked at him. I really looked at him, seeing the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the way he held his posture. He was a good man, in his own way, but he was a man who lived in a different reality than the one I had just survived. "You don't get it, Mark," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It's not about the money, and it's not about the house. It's about the fact that I spent years building a home with someone who didn't even notice when it was being invaded. You were so busy being comfortable that you stopped paying attention to your own family. That's a mistake you can't fix with a checkbook or an eviction notice." He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a second before he pulled it back, a gesture of absolute defeat. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he whispered. "I know," I said, and for once, it was the truth. "You didn't mean for it to happen, but you allowed it, and that is why I'm leaving." I didn't wait for him to respond. I got into my car, the interior smelling like clean air and fresh start, and I put it in gear. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw the house in my rearview mirror, the big, expensive, hollow structure that I had once called a dream. It looked small. It looked manageable. It looked like a place that belonged to someone else. I drove toward the city, the skyline rising up to meet me like a jagged, promise-filled horizon. The road was open, the traffic was light, and for the first time in 6 months, the knot in my chest loosened. I was losing my husband, my best friend, and the life I had meticulously curated, but I was gaining something much more valuable, my own life back. I wasn't the same woman who had lived in that house. I was sharper, colder, more guarded, but I was also, finally, terrifyingly, undeniably free. The radio started playing a song I hadn't heard in years, something upbeat and defiant, and I turned it up, letting the music wash over me, drowning out the ghosts of the life I was leaving behind. I wasn't going to look back again. I had seen enough, and I was ready to see what was next.
কার বাসরে ঘুমাও তুমি, কারে নিয়ে চলো, আমায় রেখে কেন প্রিয়া গিয়াছ রে বলো। কার বাসরে ঘুমাও তুমি, কারে নিয়ে চলো, আমায় রেখে কেন প্রিয়া গিয়াছ রে বলো। কার মনেতে তোমার আশা রাখো জমা করে, আমার আশা পুইরা দিয়া তুমি রইলা দূরে। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। আসলে ভালো বললে রে তুই আশা গুলো দিয়ে, চইলা গেলে কষ্ট দিয়া নতুন সাথী নিয়ে। বাসলে ভালো বললে রে তুই আশা গুলো দিয়ে, চইলা গেলে কষ্ট দিয়া নতুন সাথী নিয়ে। তোর প্রেমেরই মন্ত্র ছিল অভিনয়ের জাল, তোর কথা বিশ্বাস কইরা হইল আমার কাল। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। কার মনেতে বাসা বাঁধো আমায় রেখে রে, কার মুখেতে ফুটাও হাসি আমায় কাঁদিয়ে। কার মনেতে বাসা বাঁধো আমায় রেখে রে, কার মুখেতে ফুটাও হাসি আমায় কাঁদিয়ে। স্বার্থ নিয়া করলে খেলায় আমার সাথে রে, পর ভাবিয়া দূরে গেলে আমায় রেখে রে। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই,